This is Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, and we are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Welcome back, David. We missed you the last couple of weeks.
I missed you and everybody.
And we have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader.
I missed Ralph.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Good to have David back.
First up, the Reverend Dr. William Barber returns to speak with us about the upcoming Poor People's Campaign March and Assembly in Washington, D.C. that's coming up on June 29th. He also has a new book coming out next week called White Poverty: How Exposing Myths About Race and Class Can Reconstruct American Democracy. In the book, he argues that poverty, quote, is not an isolated experience in America. It's everywhere. And while it disproportionately weighs on black and brown people, this basic fact of American inequality remains hidden in plain sight. White people are by far the largest racial demographic among Americans poor, unquote. We will look forward to speaking with him about his work, bringing black, white, and brown people together to fight the common enemy, poverty. Next, we welcome back Phil Mattera from Good Jobs First. Good Jobs First is a national policy resource center that promotes corporate and government accountability in economic development. Mr. Mattera is the director of Good Jobs First Corporate Research Project and author of the blog Dirt Diggers Digest on corporate misbehavior. We'll talk to him about the new report out of Good Jobs First, which he co-authored. It's entitled The High Cost of Misconduct: Corporate Penalties Reached the $1 trillion mark. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's talk about the upcoming Poor People's Campaign March and Assembly in Washington, D.C. on June 29th. David?
Reverend Dr. William Barber is president and senior lecturer of Repairers of the Breach, which was established to train communities in moral movement building. He is co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and founding director and professor at the Center for Public Theology and Public Policy at Yale Divinity School. His new book is White Poverty: How Exposing Myths About Race and Class Can Reconstruct American Democracy. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Reverend Dr. William Barber.
I am so glad to be back with my friend Ralph Nader and all of you who are here. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for sure. Again, Reverend Barber. Now, you're planning a major march for the Poor People's Campaign on June 29th, a mass assembly in the District of Columbia. Can you give us an idea of the range of your agenda that you are going to talk about when you do your Poor People's March?
Well, Ralph, we're talking about 135 million poor and low-wealth people in this country today. We're talking about over 40% of our adults, 50% of our children, and we're talking about 58% of Black people, which is 26 million people, and over 30% of white people, which is 66 million, 58% of Latinos and natives. And we're now talking about where poor and low-wage people make up 30% of the electorate, and almost 42 to 43% in so-called battleground states where the margin of victory for president was less than 3%. It's time to center the needs and the demands of these persons in our politics. Too often we have denied them. We've had debate after debate and not even a word mentioned. Candidates are not even asked, Democrat or Republican, what will you do to address the unnecessary reality of poverty, the abolishable reality of poverty, and the fact that 800 people are dying a day from poverty, 295,000 people a year. So on June 29th, Saturday at 10 o'clock on Pennsylvania and 3rd, we are assembling a mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly mall march on Washington and to the polls, which is a part of an effort we launched on March the 2nd to touch 15 million poor, low-wage work infrequent voters who, when they vote, they tend to vote for more progressive ideas. But the number one reason they don't vote, Ralph, is they say no one talks to them. And what the agenda that's uniting our 30 anchor groups that now represent over 60 million people, from labor to the National Council of Churches, are these. Number one, we're saying to politicians, you need to answer and be very clear. Do you have a plan to abolish poverty as the fourth leading cause of death in America? Are you going to push for it and pass a living minimum wage of at least $15, more so like 17 an hour index with inflation? Are you going to be for full and expanded voting rights and ensure that the Voting Act is restored and voting rights are expanded? Are you against no more voter suppression? Are you for guaranteed worker rights and labor rights? Are you for health care for all so that a person's health care is not determined by their job but their humanity? Are you for affordable, adequate housing with the millions of people who are on the brink of homelessness and are homeless? Are you for strong social welfare and safety net programs? Are you going to push legislation and policy that will put an end to gun violence and profit and proliferation of guns? Are you for fully protected women's rights, environmental justice that secures clean air, clean land, clean water? Are you for justice for all indigenous nations? Are you for fully funded public education? Are you for just immigration laws? Are you for addressing militarism and the war economy? And are you for standing for peace and not war, calling for an immediate ceasefire of Israel in Gaza that allows immediate humanitarian release, for Hamas to release all of the hostages, for peace and justice to be pursued, and an end, not only there, but to genocide around the world, like in the Congo and Somalia? And are you fighting for an end to hate, division, and extremist political agenda? It is this agenda that's uniting poor and low wealth people from the Delta to Detroit, from Appalachia to Alabama, from the Tenderloin in San Francisco to upstate New York, down to Florida. This is the agenda that is coming up from the people. And what they are saying is this is what they want to hear politicians talk about and how they determine who they're going to vote for.
And I might add, for our listeners, a lot of these social safety net measures have been long enacted and are operating in Western Europe, in Canada, even in places like Taiwan and Japan, like full health insurance and a lot of the labor rights, the absence of voter suppression, higher minimum wages. And in Western Europe, they have abolished poverty as we know it in the United States.
Right. Well, we ought to be talking about abolishing poverty. You know, when we ought to be talking about not just tweaking it, but abolishing it. I mean, when you think about it, we're going to have a couple of caskets there that day, and we're going to have the numbers of people who died. You know, poor people died at a rate 3 to 5 times higher so far during COVID, the height of COVID, because of their poverty. 350,000 people died during COVID from the lack of health care, not from the disease. It is a moral, political, and economic tragedy that people are playing Russian roulette with their lives when they go on a low-wage job. You know, we call people essential workers. But Ralph, I met people yesterday who were, I was at a labor piece in Charlotte, airport workers who are the people that, you know, that clean the airlines, and they're striking and they formed a union. But what they said was during COVID height, they were told they were essential workers. They were absolutely needed. But then they said, well, if we're absolutely needed, do we get living wages? No. Do we get health care? No. Do we get paid family leave? No. Can we at least bring a bottle of water on the plane when we're cleaning, because those planes get up to 115 degrees in the summertime? They were told no, and some of them have to literally drink the leftover water from the passengers that have gotten off the plane. This is absolutely ridiculous, you know, that we are not doing these things that would lift the lives of over 40% of our population.
What I like about your agenda, Reverend Barber, is it pays attention to both discriminatory injustice against poor, minorities, women, and indiscriminate injustice that affects everybody, like environmental toxins and the war economy and other things. So you blend them together, what could be the most unstoppable political force in contemporary American scene, which is left-right support.
This coalition is not just, you know, to have a day, but to really build out a movement. And every day, new persons are coming on. We will do another announcement in 2 weeks of organizations that are joining with us. We're mobilizing heavy in the DMV in the first 300 miles away from DC. And one thing that people are saying why they're interested is because this is not just a gathering of a day, and it's not just a gathering for a few high-profile people to speak. the messengers are going to be the impacted people. And many of the people are committing to the larger effort of mobilizing these poor and low wealth voters, because we did some metric, Ralph, and we've been teaching people this. And everywhere we've taught it, people either say, I didn't know it, or they say, damn, why didn't we know this before now? And what I mean by that is, we did some study. We got a couple of scholars to do some study. And we said, what would it take of the poor and low wage infrequent voters? What percentage of them would it take to change the elections based on the margin of victories in past elections? And, you know, Democrats and Republicans are really should look at this. So Linda Lake said, who's a great pollster, said this is the largest block of voters that could potentially transform the electorate. And here's what it said. We found out that in Michigan, it would only take 1% of poor and low wage voters that didn't vote to outdistance the margin of victory. In Pennsylvania, only 3%. In Wisconsin, under 3%. In Florida, under 4 to 6%. In Arizona, 12%. In Maine, North Carolina, 18%. In Georgia, 20%. Now, what does that mean? In Michigan, the margin of victory was 10,000 votes. There were over 1 million poor and low wage voters that didn't vote. In Wisconsin, the margin of victory was 20,000 in the presidential election. Over 1 million poor and low wage voters didn't vote. In Pennsylvania, the margin was 40,000, but over 3 million poor and low wage voters were infrequent voters didn't vote. In North Carolina, it was 160,000, but over 1 million poor and low wage voters didn't vote. Everywhere you look, there's not, we call battleground states. I don't like that term because I don't think we really know what battleground states are because everybody hasn't voted. But for sake of conversation, in the states where the margin of victory for the presidency was less than 3% or less, poor and low wage voters make up almost 43% of the electorate. That's the power. And the more we talk about this, people are starting to see that we don't have to sit back and just take things like 2 years ago when 49 Republicans and 8 Democrats voted against raising the minimum wage to a living wage that hasn't been raised since 2009. They are starting to say, wait a minute, we have power. We have power now to literally transform the electorate. And so our mantra is our votes are not for support, they are for demand. And if you want these votes, you need to speak to these agendas. You need to demand that the media, when they have debates, that these issues are asked, that these issues are centered at your convention. You need to center these issues. If you want this sleeping giant to wake up, you need to center. But the sleeping giant is also saying we're going to wake up anyway, because it's high time that poor and low wage folk, the most moral people in this country, the folk that make this country work, these central workers, it's high time that their agenda is taken seriously.
Yeah. Well, you're tapping into about 120 million people are not going to vote in November. That's a huge pool. You convert just a small percentage, especially in the swing states. You carry the state, given the electoral college, at least at the presidential level. Listening to you, Reverend Barber, makes me wonder about the two parties. I mean, the Republicans aren't interested in getting out the vote. They work to repress the vote. But the Democrats presumably are interested in expanding the vote. And they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, literally, on television ads, 30-second insipid ads that give 15% commission to their corporate conflicted political media consultants. And they're not going to get non-voters that way. You don't put on 30-second ads with emotional content that doesn't relate to the lives of low-wage people. The way you do it is you put it into ground campaigns where, as you say, real human beings talk to poor people, listen to poor people, respect poor people, learn from poor people, and show poor people how if they turn out to vote, they can change the political priorities in this country that comes right down to a better livelihood and life for their children and grandchildren. And how do you get this message to the people at the top of this party? Are they listening to you? Do they call you? Do they read what you're writing? This book, White Poverty, should be put in every legislator's hands. We're going to get to that in a moment, listeners. But this message here of how relatively easy it is to swing these swing states with turning out relatively minor extra percentages of low-wage workers. I mean, this is the winning strategy for 2024, period. Everything else is much more speculative. Are they listening to you?
Well, this is why we have mass movements, to make people listen. There's a song, Make Them Hear You. This is why we're mobilizing and going after 15 million poor and low wage voters with this agenda. This is why we say to both parties, the Republicans tend to blame poor folk for their poverty, and that's ridiculous. And they tend to make poverty just being a black or brown issue because they want to marginalize it, racialize it, and then just dismiss it. But Democrats too often will talk about those who are trying to make it into the middle class. They won't say the word poverty. Now, what's interesting is in the last State of the Union, the president actually said the poor, he said the word. And we believe the more and more we push, it's going to make folk have to recognize you cannot ignore this. It's not just saving the democracy, Ralph. It's what kind of democracy do we want to save? Do we want to save a democracy, and saving it is have a democracy where 87 million people are uninsured or underinsured, where 5 million people get up every morning, can buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water, where 50-some million poor people work for less than a living wage? That's not the kind of democracy we want to save, because it doesn't line up with establishing justice and promoting the general welfare. So the point is, we're going to make them hear. And if I was advising any party, I would say you should sit down with poor and low wage folk of every race, creed, and color. You should hear from them. And what you should do is to stop just talking about what you've done and stop trying to find a silver bullet, like one issue, abortion, or one issue, tax cut. But look comprehensively at the lives of 40% of your country and almost 40% of the electorate, and say, if you give our party the majority, this is what we will do in the first 50 days, not 100 days. In the first 50 days, we will pass living wages and index. In the first 50 days, we'll guarantee health care for all. In the first 50 days, we will make a declaration that we are going to abolish poverty. People would hear that. And the point that you're making, if you make it so that this is not just good for poor and low wage folk, but it's good for the country itself, and you deny the lies, you dismiss the lies, you tear apart the lies that say if you lift from the bottom that it's going to hurt everybody. No, it's going to actually make things better. And then you put a face on it. To the parties, I say, put a face on these numbers. They're not just numbers, they are real people. And every time you talk about this, if I was president or candidate, every time I talked about these issues, I'd have folk around me who represent the issues, who represent the numbers. I think that's where we are in this country. And what we've decided, we're not going to wait on the politicians to hear us. We're going to make them hear us. There's not been an effort to go after the poor and low-wage voters like we're talking about in any recent time. There's not been an effort to pull together a massive assembly in Washington and across the nation like we're doing this time. The organization that we pull together have a total of over 60 million constituents, over 60 million constituents. And if we just activate 10% of the 60, and if they just activate in any state, if 20% of poor and low wage voters that have not voted were moved to vote around an agenda, and they looked at each candidate based on their agenda. And one of the things we can do, even for C3, is we can produce a report card we don't tell people who to vote for, but we can show what they have voted for. And we can say, this person is for living wage, this one isn't, this, and show that and give people the option. We believe in the heart and the intellect and the insight of poor and low wage people. If they know their power, if they know what's going on, they will mobilize in a massive way.
I want to spend a few minutes on your book. This is really a long overdue book. I know, listeners, we live in a decayed culture, and that Taylor Swift and her boyfriend in one day got more national coverage than the Poor People's Campaign. So it is a society, a hedonistic society in decay. But this book, White Poverty, How Exposing Myths About Race and Class Can Reconstruct American Democracy. It's by Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II with Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. You teach a course at Yale on civic engagement. You're starting a center at Yale University, and I wish you could have started it at my alma mater, Princeton University. But Steve Scroban, who graduated from Yale, would be more pleased with your choice, I'm sure.
And let me say something just about the book itself. Open the book saying that I'm an African American with Caucasian and Native American roots, but I'm an African American. And I'm writing this as an African American through the lens of my brothers, white brothers and sisters that I've met for several reasons. Number one, Dr. King told us in 65, the greatest fear of the greedy racist oligarch in this country was for the masses of poor Black people and white people to come together and form a voting bloc that could fundamentally shift the economic architecture of the country. Secondly, too often I have seen whenever a discussion about poverty comes up, it is immediately identified as a Black issue, as though, white people are not affected. And the actual numbers show us that there are 40 million more white people in poverty and low wage than there are Black people in raw numbers, even though the percentage of Black people of their race is 40% higher. And I wrote it looking at various stories throughout the country to say that we've got these mythologies, like, for instance, poor white people vote against their own self-interest, but the data actually doesn't show that in terms of the majority. Or this issue that Black and white people cannot form alliances, which is really not true. There have been many alliances down through history, and we often don't talk about the deliberate division that was done by the so-called Southern strategy, where they deliberately were so afraid of Black-white coalitions that they did everything they could to split them and to splinter those relationships. In the book, I talk about being in East Kentucky and meeting with Black and white coal miners. In East Kentucky, predominantly white. When I went there, some people told me, don't go. It's predominantly white. It's racist. It's this, that, and the other. It's not going to be healthy for you to go. We went up there to Harlan County. We went to Hazard County, with the Dukes of Hazzard. And we found kindred with people. We found people who were there when Lyndon Baines Johnson announced the Poor People War on Poverty. We found Black and white coal miners who was in that community working. And we found white people, coal miners, who were mad at how Mitch McConnell and others had literally allowed multinational companies to come in, take over the coal mines without having to grandfather in their labor rights, and how they were hurting. We found folks that were livid at the fact that people would come to their community and try to sell them on the best thing you need to be doing is being against voting rights, against gay people, against women's right to choose, as though those things were going to put any food on their table or any money in their pocket. And several of those counties flipped in 2018 when Bert Shear, who ran for governor in Kentucky, went to those communities and spoke with them and talked to them. And out of there said, when I become governor, I'm going to push the living wages into health care. And we talked about those communities. We found people who were upset the fact that they needed Medicaid expansion, but that people were blocking it in their state because they hated Obama. And in the process of hating Obama, they were hurting the very people of the state. So the book is filled with stories of my white brothers and sisters that often get ignored when we talk about the issue of poverty, and how white and Black is played against each other by the oligarchy and those who do the work of the oligarchy in this country. And the book says we're destroying that mythology. We're unpacking it. We talk about in the book, one of the things I think I allude to is in the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, they used to sing a song, "Which Side Are You On? Which Side Are You On?" But that song was actually written by a white woman in Kentucky when the bosses and the sheriff came to arrest her white husband, who was a coal miner. And he started singing, "Which side are you on? Which side are you on?" And today we see young African Americans singing that same song. In some way, we see the kindredness of issues and oppression that if these bodies can come together and unite, not by ignoring the issue of race, but by dealing with it and dealing with race and class together, and recognizing the power that they have together, there can be some real fundamental change.
One myth you're exposing is the thousands of years technique of divide and rule by the ruling powers all over the world. Divide and rule. And what you're saying is all of these injustices basically affect people regardless of race and class. They affect people and they bleed the same color. Yeah. There are divisions, obviously, on reproductive rights, but on the vast majority of political rights and economic rights and environmental rights, there's a huge unity between the people. As I have said again and again, if you polled the question, do you think there should be tougher enforcement on corporate crime and put these corporate crooks after prosecution and conviction in jail comes in over 85%. Over 85%. And what I like about what you talk about is you don't give corporations a free hand. You know what a dominant force they are, both in dividing and rule and in sucking up the hard-earned gains of hardworking people into their executive suites and overpaid compensation packages. Why do you think both parties now are still playing the divide and rule game, talking about polarization, red state, blue state, conservative, liberal, when you've demonstrated with other people that that's not in accordance with the facts on the ground?
Well, I don't know the why, but I know what. I know what it is. It's foolish. And it's the language of left versus right and liberal versus conservative is too puny, it's too small. It doesn't bring us together. It creates division from the top. What we should be talking about are the issues that talk to the 55 million people who make less than a living wage. That's what we should be talking about. We don't have to deny any part of it. I'm a black man, but I can still care about white poverty and unify around the issues that affect all people. You know, there's a sense in which we have to have an allness now, you know, the justice for all people. And as you said earlier, I kind of say it in the book laughingly, but very seriously, if you don't make enough money to pay your light bill, we're all black in the dark. If your baby can't eat because you don't have enough money to feed that baby doesn't cry black or white, that baby cries hunger. And I want folks to understand this is not a book that says, well, just dismiss racism and dismiss the impact of racism or the impact of geography. You know, like 1/3 of all poor people live in the South, 1/3 of all white poor people live in the South. You have to disaggregate those things. But at the same time, you have to look at what is unifying that causes this. Well, what causes it is that, for instance, in the South, the majority of the persons that get elected, they get elected by lying to people about homophobia, lying about women's right to choose, trying to say that those things are anti-God and anti-faith. They use those trickeries and divided ways, but what they don't ever do is answer what they're going to do about the poor in their areas. In fact, they actually deny it. They don't talk about it. And what we have to have is a coming together that doesn't allow people to do that. And part of it is we got to challenge the media. You know, our campaign is writing right now every major media that's going to have anything to do with debates and say, we can't have any more debates for president or this country where you go for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and not 15 or 20 minutes is even dealt with and things are brought up as it relates to the poor and low wealth wage of this country. We can't do that anymore. We're going to have to demand that it doesn't happen, because what you end up doing is you end up having an impoverished democracy where we end up talking more about, you know, who had a trial and what color their hair was and who insulted a woman, which we should deal with, but we leave so many of the serious matters, the matters that impact people's lives. How can you have conversations today, Ralph, and you got 200,000+ people dying from poverty, and it's not even registered? It doesn't even come up in our debates. You're not even, if you run for president of this country, you're not even asked what you will do about that reality. What's your vision for addressing those realities? And that's why this book, White Poverty, was written to unpack the mythologies. And the last thing I'll say is, you know, I come out of the South, and the Southern strategist said, we're going to divide the very coalition that can change things. We're going to use hatred. We're going to use the animus against the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the peace movement to intentionally divide. They called it positive division, positive separation. They said, we're going to do it intentionally. And if it gets out of hand, or if somebody gets elected that takes it too far, we're going to lie and say we didn't do it. But we're going to use positive polarization in this nation. We have to resist that now. And that's why this book is written, to show how we unpack the mythologies, the false division, and we bring people together.
And the book is called White Poverty. It's out June 11th, but available now everywhere. And take it, read it, and mobilize. One last question before we ask Steve pitch in here. You're talking to an auditorium full of young African Americans who voted in 2020, but are telling pollsters they're not likely to vote in 2024. What do you say to them?
I have a real problem with that narrative, because I've seen it happen for you get in a close election, and then there's this effort to almost blame black people or young people. I was in a group of young black African Americans the other day from 10 HBCUs, and none of them were talking about not voting. What they were talking about is they want to know where people stand on the issues like with what's going on in Gaza. Interestingly enough, the second issue was voting rights and living wage, and then the third one was healthcare. And they are saying not that they're not going to vote, but they're demanding that these issues be addressed and that they know where people stand on these issues. Now, you might can find every now and then somebody that says they're not going to vote over one issue. But when you actually drill down and actually talk to, go on these campuses, the majority of young African Americans are not talking about not voting. They're saying we're challenging these candidates not to play with us, to speak to the issues that we care about. And they care about what's happening across the waters, but they also care about the poverty that their family, that their mamas and their daddies are experiencing, because their mamas and daddies don't even make a living wage. They care about the fact that their grandmamas and granddaddies fought for voting rights. And now we have less voting rights than we had in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act being gutted. And they watched their loved ones die from the lack of health care. And if I was in an auditorium, I would tell them, keep pressing your issues. Demand that these parties answer you. Demand that politicians answer you. Vote, but don't just vote for a person. Vote for an agenda and demand that your agenda be heard. Mobilize, mobilize, mobilize. And then when I'm on campus with them, I teach them how powerful. I said, some of you are in places where if everybody on your college campus voted, you could determine who sits in the Congress. You could determine who sits in the Senate and in the presidency. And they say, what? I say, yeah, you have more power. Don't give up that power. Use that power. But I disagree with some of the narrative that's coming out because I don't think that even the posters and some of the media are really talking in depth enough to enough of young African Americans, both in the street and in college, than they should be. These young folk are deep. I have 5 of them in my house, and they don't even agree with me all the time. They push me to give them answers, and I taught them to do that. And these young folk have come of age, and what they're saying is, talk about what you're going to do and what's your vision for the future, and we'll vote for you.
Steve?
Reverend Barber, let me ask you this. Last week, we had a political scientist on the program last week, and he talked about politics being a dominance game and that people don't really parse policy issues and agenda, that they vote on emotion and they vote for the person who appears the most strong, whatever their policy agenda is. So how do you turn your policy agenda into that emotional appeal, into that politics of dominance?
Well, one of the things is we let people know this is a matter of life and death. We don't have to let them know. As I said, the people that are going to be on the stage on the 29th are people that die when these policies stay like they are. And there's nothing more emotional than that when something is literally has the power to take you out. But I majored in political science and public policy and all. You know, we tend to vote that way because that's all we're fed. I mean, the construct of our debates, what the media is drawn to, feeds. If the media did a month of stories on the level of poverty and death in this country, people would turn to it. If we talked about these living wages as much as we talk about how long somebody's in the courtroom and how many times they went to sleep and how many times their hair fell out of place, you know, if we talked about these issues, people would come alive. But too often, that's not what happens. You know, we tend to focus on, I think about Ralph says it, has said it. You know, we've been pushing all the major media, not to get me on, but to get impacted people on, you know, to put the mamas from West Virginia and the mamas from Alabama that are all together crying for living wages and telling their stories. If we did that, people would shift. I give the analogy of the young man that fell out on the football field and we thought he had died, and everybody got involved, gave him money. They were cheering for him. Why? Because they saw it in front of their faces. They didn't even know his name. They didn't care for a minute whether he was black or brown. They saw him almost die. It's because they saw it. And part of our problem is, you know, the way in which we film and follow these political candidates, you know, we often major in the minors. We've heard more about Biden's aid from the media than we've heard about policy. We hear more about, you know, Trump's women than we've heard about the fact that this man wants to turn around the 14th Amendment. He wants to do this. He wants to do this. If we really told the story of the policy and how those policies were going to affect people's everyday lives, I believe the American public will shift in that direction. And
David?
that's why we have to have a mass movement to try to shift the narrative.
Well, unfortunately, Reverend Barber, we're out of time. The new book by Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II with Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove is called White Poverty. And I urge you to read this book and then spread the word, because the November election is coming up fast, and the mass march by the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C., Saturday, June 29th, should be viewed not just as a clarion call for justice in its various dimensions, but as a major movement that can affect the outcome of the November campaign. And that's the way the media has got to be educated to cover it. Otherwise, they'll continue to ignore the pleas of tens of millions of people who don't meet the criteria for media sensationalism. Thank you very much, Reverend Barber.
Thank you so much. Let me just say, we're saying to folk, if you want to help this movement, go to www.poorpeoplescampaign.org. If Repairs of the Breach holds the mobilizing, and we have a special fund just for this, you can go to www.breachrepairers. And take care to all of you and all of your listeners, and we look to see you on June 29th.
We've been speaking with Reverend Dr. William Barber. We will link to the upcoming Poor People's Campaign's March and Assembly in Washington, D.C. on June 29th. We'll link to that at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, there's a corporate crime wave that costs companies trillions, but the costs to us are incalculable. But first, let's check in with our own corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, June 7, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau last week finalized a rule to establish a registry to detect and deter corporate offenders that have broken consumer laws and are subject to federal, state, or local government or court orders. The registry will also help the CFPB to identify repeat offenders and recidivism trends. Too often, financial firms treat penalties for illegal activity as the cost of doing business, said CFPB Director Rohit Chopra. The CFPB's new rule will help law enforcement across the country detect and stop repeat offenders. The CFPB's new registry will facilitate better understanding of bad actors that seek to restart a scam, fraudulent scheme, or other illegal conduct that harms the public. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, Ralph, and the rest of the team. For nearly a quarter century, corporations have had to pay out $1 trillion in fines and penalties. Is this altering their behavior, or is it just the cost of doing business? David?
Phil Mattera serves as Violation Tracker Project Director and Corporate Research Project Director at Good Jobs First. Mr. Mattera is a licensed private investigator, author of 4 books on business, labor, and economics, and a longtime member of the National Writers Union. His blog on corporate research and corporate misbehavior is called the Dirt Diggers Digest, and he has written more than 70 critical company profiles for the Corporate Rap Sheets section of the Corporate Research Project website. He is co-author with Siobhan Standard of the new report, The High Cost of Misconduct. Corporate penalties reach the $1 trillion mark. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Phil Mattera.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, welcome back, Phil. For our listeners, this report came out in April and was ignored by the mainstream press. It collects $1 trillion of penalties over the last 25 years on companies like Enron, Purdue, the drug company Wells Fargo, Volkswagen, the champion of all the penalties, Bank of America, over $80 billion, BP, the oil company, and other firms that are named in the report. Phil, before we get into the report, I have to chide you. The report is called The High Cost of Misconduct. You should have said the high cost of corporate crime, fraud, and abuse. You know, that you can't use mealy-mouthed language when you discuss corporate crimes that cost people's lives and poison their environment, sell them dangerous pharmaceuticals, create fake bank accounts, mislead them on the emissions in their car, cause huge wildfires, Pacific Gas and Electric, for example, in California, cheat them on their mortgages, cheat them on their toxic securities, their stocks, the drug pricing abuses, and as you point out, opioid crisis. There are hundreds of thousands of people in the United States who've died because of this. So if you put out a new report, tell me, are you going to change the title?
Well, we should have asked you to do the PR for this, Ralph. I mean, there is a subtitle to the report.
This is a very tightly written report, and it's a gross understatement, as I'm sure Phil will agree, because when you have 25 years of tiny enforcement budgets by the Department of Justice and EPA and OSHA and SEC, Federal Trade Commission, I mean, one giant law firm has more lawyers than almost dealing with defending corporate crooks than these agencies put together.
The title, Ralph, actually is meant to kind of have a dual meaning. On the one hand, the cost, we refer to the $1 trillion in penalties that we've documented in our violation tracker database. But actually, the cost to society is actually much greater because, given all the kinds of things you were just referring to, you're
right there. I'm saying if there were adequate enforcement budgets, wouldn't you agree, Phil, that it would be far more than $1 trillion in penalties over 25 years?
Oh, certainly. And then there are always going to be cases where the companies don't get caught and are causing harm anyway.
Well, where did you get these figures from? Question number 2.
Well, they're all based on data that we've collected in our violation tracker database. So we've been gathering data now, for 9 years in this database where we go to every federal regulatory agency, all the branches of the Justice Department, all the state regulators, the state attorneys general, et cetera. And we just pull in all the data on these cases, which are in the public domain, but no one else goes to the trouble of amassing all this and looking at it in its totality. And that's what we've done. And, we've been kind of adding up these penalties, and we reached a milestone of $1 trillion cumulatively since 2000. And we thought it would be a good time to put out this report to give an overview of what we've been documenting for 9 years in this database.
After decades of delay, isn't it a little encouraging that the Senate Judiciary Committee is considering ordering the Justice Department to create a corporate crime database? And just very recently, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is a really revived enforcement arm against corporate financial crimes by its wonderful director, Rohit Chopra, who was a former Federal Trade Commission commissioner. Aren't they starting something too?
Yeah,
to collect data on corporate crime?
Yeah, they contacted us about this, and we provided data from Violation Tracker to help the CFPB prepare its rule. They wanted to try to get an estimate ahead of time of how many companies might be kind of affected by this rule, how many repeat offenders would go into this registry that they're creating. And they turned to us, and we provided data. And in fact, if you look in the rule that they issued on page 405, it mentions Violation Tracker and mentions the data that we provided to them.
And do you think that this is going to actually occur?
Well, I don't see why not. I mean, the CFPB is in much better shape now. Their legal legitimacy has now been affirmed
by the Supreme Court, right?
Yeah. So I don't see why they can't go ahead with this. I mean, obviously they're going to be, I'm sure the Chamber of Commerce and others are going to challenge this, but I don't see why they can't do this. They're not doing anything besides collecting information that's already in the public domain the same way that we do.
You remember when Trump was selected president by the antiquated Electoral College in 2016, he proceeded to dismantle the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Literally, he put someone in charge who said it's to service Wall Street, and he fired people and blocked a lot of enforcement, turned it into a dud agency. So we have to be careful that doesn't happen again. Discuss some of the companies by name and their violations.
Well, we have a running tally on Violation Tracker and in the report of which companies account for the most cumulative penalties. And at the very top of the list is Bank of America at $87 billion in cumulative penalties. And that includes the penalties associated with the companies that they've taken over, like Merrill Lynch. So second on the list is JP Morgan Chase at about 39 billion, BP third at 36 billion, and that's of course largely related to the Deepwater Horizon disaster and the Texas City disaster. And then, we've got a few more banks. The banks are well up there. The Swiss bank UBS at 31 billion, and that includes the cases that were previously linked to Credit Suisse, which UBS had to take over. Wells Fargo at 27 billion, and a lot of that is related to the bogus accounts scandal that they were at the center of. Citigroup, 26 billion, and Volkswagen, 26 billion. And of course, a lot of that is related to the big emissions cheating scandal. So those are some of the companies at the top of the list in terms of total violations. But in the report, what we also did was to look at which companies were the biggest repeat offenders and which companies had the most penalties of $1 million or more, right, to kind of filter out the smaller cases. And the big banks are again at the top of the list. Bank of America has had 225 separate cases in which they paid $1 million or more in fines or penalties. I mean, that's an amazing number to me. I mean, talk about recidivism, that's an amazing track record.
And our listeners might wonder, are these penalties deductible under the federal income tax laws for corporations?
I think they often are, unfortunately, yes.
Well, when you put this report out, Phil, I'm sure you sent it to the Justice Department and the various enforcement agencies. Did you get any reply from them at all?
No, we haven't.
Did you get any reply from anybody? Law professors, prosecutors?
Yeah, I mean, we've gotten replies from activists, from academics. We have a lot of academics who use our data to do kind of scholarly analyses and so forth. So we weren't ignored entirely, but in terms of major media, we haven't gotten a lot of attention.
What do you mean by double dipping? You say among the double dippers are American International Group as an insurer, Boeing, Deutsche Bank, Teva Pharmaceuticals. What is this double dipping about?
Well, I think that you may be talking about the section where we talk about the non-prosecution and the deferred prosecution agreements.
Yes.
And as you know, this is a big problem with the Justice Department. It has this addiction to leniency agreements, and it wants to give companies an opportunity, not to have to plead guilty when there actually are criminal cases brought against them. So they offer them these strange deals, non-prosecution and deferred prosecution. And the theory is that the company is going to be so shaken up by the possibility of a criminal charge that they'll clean up their act and they'll never do bad things again. But what we've seen over and over again is the companies get the leniency agreement and then they break the rules again. And sometimes the Justice Department responds by giving them another leniency agreement. So it turns the whole process into a farce. So that was one of the things we document in the report.
Your report also talks about state enforcement of these criminal laws. Sometimes the states are empowered to enforce federal laws like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, but they have their own relatively modest corporate criminal laws. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, we found a kind of a mixed record at the state level. On the one hand, it's kind of encouraging that state AGs sometimes band together and bring aggressive cases against large companies on consumer protection or opioids, et cetera. But then in other cases, they don't do a good job at the state level of enforcing those laws, as you mentioned, like the environmental laws, where they share responsibility with the federal government. Some states do a better job than other states. In fact, we did a report a couple of years ago, particularly on the environmental enforcement, and we found a wide disparity among the states and how active they are at enforcement.
Yeah, California seems to be one of the more active enforcement states.
Yeah, California is active in various regards at the state level. It's also interesting in California, the local district attorneys are active and they will bring cases on consumer protection and environmental cases. And sometimes different counties will band together and bring a kind of a group action against a large company.
Well, I noticed in your conclusion, Phil, you said that, quote, we've been living through a continuous corporate crime wave, end quote, continuous corporate crime wave. And you say monetary penalties, I'm quoting you, monetary penalties are meant in part to deter future transgressions, but there's no indication that's happening. Instead, the fines and settlements seem to be regarded as little more than a cost of doing business. Presumably, the profits from wrongdoing outweigh the penalties, end quote. In other words, corporate crime pays. Hannah?
My question is about kind of flipping the information into action. So for listeners, for civilians, what are some actions that you think are kind of logical next steps for the report? I'm looking at it and I notice that some states deny FOI requests from non-residents. So I'm like, oh, if I lived in Arkansas, maybe I could submit an FOI request because I'm a resident, or people working at companies leaking data or becoming whistleblowers. Or so what are specific actions that you hope to see coming out of sharing this information?
Well, certainly we're always, interested in more transparency about both the misconduct and about enforcement actions. We feel that there's no justification for agencies to ever, keep this information secret in terms of what they're doing. In terms of, putting the information to use, I think there needs to be more pressure on companies, particularly high-profile companies that have been involved in these offenses. A lot of companies seem to think that, they pay their penalty, they just move on, and it's as if it never happened. And some of these are the same companies who are professing to, believe in ESG and social responsibility and all that kind of stuff. I think these companies need to be confronted with their track record, across the board. One of the reasons, we created Violation Tracker is to show that misconduct and criminality is not limited to certain, narrow areas, that there's a whole continuum, whether it's, environmental, labor practices, financial practices, consumer protection, investor protection, that there's a whole range of misconduct that needs to be highlighted. And a lot of big companies engage in a lot of kinds of misconduct, and they need to be confronted with that, whether it's, through the shareholder activist process, whether it's through, labor activism, environmental activism, or other things. I was just on a webinar yesterday where there's, discussion about, bringing criminal cases against oil companies in connection with their climate harm that they've brought on the planet. So any kind of aggressive action, whether it's in the legal arena, the regulatory arena, the public relations arena, it needs to come from lots of different directions to put pressure on companies.
Illustrative of the power of campaign cash in the coffers of these lawmakers, cracking down on corporate crooks is hugely popular in the U.S. It comes in like 85%, which means there's a lot of left-right support all over the country to get the sheriffs going, to get the federal cops on the corporate beat moving. And you would think members of Congress would react to that. They're supposed to have their finger to the wind, but instead they have their pocket open for the cash. And I think if you're going to go up on Capitol Hill with Public Citizen, you should equip yourself, Phil, with the polls and the overwhelming support for cracking down on corporate crime, fraud, and abuse, on the taxpayer ripping off Medicare and Medicaid by the health so-called industry, the banks, etc. What are we waiting for? How can people get this report, Phil Mattera, and look it up? And before we close, tell us a little bit about this wonderful organization you're with, Good Jobs First.
All right. Well, the report is available it's for free. There's a link to it on the homepage of Violation Tracker. You can just Google Violation Tracker and you use the database as well as read the report, and you can search thousands and thousands of companies, large and small, to see what their crime and misconduct track records are. Just Google the phrase violation tracker or put in violationtracker.org and you'll get there.
Now, about Good Jobs First?
So Violation Tracker is produced by Good Jobs First, which is a nonprofit research center, which also focuses on corporate subsidies. In fact, we have another database called Subsidy Tracker, where we look at all the ways in which companies receive, undue financial incentives from state, local, and federal government agencies. So we're kind of a corporate watchdog organization, and our focus is on these two areas, on corporate crime and misconduct on the one hand, and corporate subsidies on the other hand.
And to the listeners, use that information. Spread the word. Tell your candidates asking for your vote to make corporate crime a major issue in their campaigning and in their agenda. Thank you very much, Phil Mattera of Good Jobs First.
Thank you.
I want to thank our guests again, Reverend Dr. William Barber and Phil Mattera of Good Jobs First. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with, in case you haven't heard, a transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, you can get it for free by going to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
We have a new issue of the Capitol Hill Citizen. It's out now. To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each program. Go to the comments section of ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode. We don't necessarily like them all, but we read them all.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody.
You know what's right and you know what's wrong. Rise up,